So I do want to ask you about the resurrection, and because when I talk to Christians, the first thing they sort of say is the history is on the side of Christianity. Secular scholars, even secular scholars, concede that Jesus Christ died on the cross. And for me, I'm finding that very difficult to reconcile when it comes to Islam, because I like philosophy and religion because I don't think it encapsulates merely its discipline. It's politics, it's history, right? It's psychology. I'm just wondering, is history on the side of Islam in the regard of the resurrection? I'm not really clear on this. Could you offer some light here for me?
Yeah, I mean, just as a caveat, this is not really my topic. So
Right.
I'm going to give you my kind of intellectual perspective of how
Sure.
I've addressed all of these historical type of so-called historical frictions, if you like. Yeah. So one would argue, or they may argue, that if you look at history, there is a friction between a kind of historical understanding of some historians that whether we believe Jesus was a divine personality or religious personality, he died on the cross. The Quran says he was not killed. He did not die on the cross. So there seems to be a friction with some historians. I don't find this a problem at all, because for me, it's just all about epistemology. Because when you study the philosophy of history, which many people don't, and that's one of the missing elements in the kind of Dr. William Craig
Yeah.
arguments with regards to the historicity of, some of the positions that he believes to be true, is, well, let's talk about the philosophy of history, just like what I do with the philosophy of science. Now, the philosophy of history is that you make inferences from historical data. Now, those inferences are not absolutely true. It's your best guess. It could be a weak inference or strong inference. The point is, you can never claim I have the representation of the actual state of historical affairs. You can't say that. You can't say my conclusion here, based on a few pieces of historical data, my conclusion based on an inference is, I can never say this is the complete representation of the historical state of affairs. You just can't say that. Just like in the philosophy of science, even if you're a realist, yes, obviously you're going to say a well-confirmed successful theory that has predictive power represents the actual state of affairs, is truth. However, there is a caveat. And the caveat is it could still not be. It could still change. Even realists believe it's not complete. You cannot say that a well-confirmed theory with predictive power and a successful theory is absolutely true in that sense.
Yeah.
Obviously, because they're smart. They could never make such a claim. And we know that from history, because historically, successful theories that had predictive power ended up being false, right? So history is against them from that perspective. It's also a very simple, logical argument to understand. The same thing applies to the philosophy of history. For me, just outweighing the evidences from an epistemic point of view. So you have few pieces of data. You have some historians making this inference, and you could say it's a level 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10 epistemically concerning your conclusion relating to history. I would say, based on other factors and based on an accumulative case, based on why I believe the Quran to be true and so on and so forth, and obviously that's another big, long discussion. For me, the epistemic weight of Quranic conclusions are going to be 10 out of 10, because I believe it's come from the one who has the picture and we just have the pixel.
Right.
It's that simple. So with any historical reality, I'm going to do that epistemic weighing. So when you look at by the way, there are other arguments actually showing that the case that Jesus actually died that it's a strong case is actually, there's so many other arguments to show that it's not a strong case, but I don't want to use that now because that's not my field. But I know many Muslim apologists, many Muslim thinkers. There's a really good book called, I forgot the book now, Jesus, Man, Messenger, Messiah. You could download it from the onereason.org website. It's a very phenomenal book. I know the brother who wrote it, Abu Zakaria. In actual fact, I think I reviewed that book. And he actually deals with these concepts very well, and on his blog he deals with these concepts as well. So there are other arguments to challenge it, but I want to give people a very basic points. It becomes a conceptual tool. They could use that for other things in history that might be at odds with a Quranic perspective, for example. And it may be the case because we have a limited understanding of reality. We don't know the full historical picture. So for me, it's just that epistemic weighing. That's how I deal with it. People can make claims about so many things. People can make claims that, Jesus, the story of Jesus was actually pre-biblical, right? Pre-Jesus. It was like, you could find a similar story of, a virgin birth and stuff like that in, I think, ancient Egyptian history, right? Obviously, we have a way of understanding that, but the thing is, people could claim that that is an evidence for maybe, that the whole Christian story is based on a fiction. It's a borrowed fiction. Maybe they could make that claim. But that's irrelevant. The point I'm trying to say is people can make claims based on any types of data. How did they make those claims? What kind of inference is it? Is it a strong inference? And when you study the philosophy of history, you'll know that with these kind of things, you give it a 6 out of 10 at best, or 5 out of 10. But if I've got a source of knowledge and the claims that are being made have an epistemic weight that's heavier, in other words, it's a 10 out of 10, rationally, I'm just going to take what's more certain. Now, the question would raise is, well, how do you know it's a 10 out of 10? Of course, I agree that that's a longer theo-philosophical discussion to have. But if I truly believe that book X has come from the divine, and by virtue of it come from the divine has the full historical picture, we just have the historical pixel, then any kind of inference that we make based on limited historical data, epistemically is going to be much, much lighter, weaker than the epistemic status of claims made by God himself. Now, obviously, the right question follows, which is, well, all right, you need to prove to me that this is actually a valid source of knowledge. Show to me why the Quran is from God. Fine, that's a valid question, but this is the way I would deal with it from that perspective.
Right. It seems, this isn't your area, as you say. So it seems to me that you're kind of relying, or you personally are in this scenario are relying on your other kind of basis, or your basis of the Quran's validity and truth. That is what you're kind of relying on, instead of directly countering the historical sort of claim. You're using sort of the authority of the Quran basically to intuit that it's mistaken, that actually Jesus didn't die. But of course it isn't your area, but that I think that's what you're doing. It's like kind of like taking a step back and being more critical of how we actually come to have knowledge about history itself.
Even if I knew the full nuanced academic stuff saying the historicity of the claim, I would still use this approach, because remember, the friction is history with the Quran. Now, if I go into history to debate the historical point and actually show that actually your historical inference is weaker because there's other historical evidence you've missed out, what I'm doing though is I'm giving the impression to the listener, or to the one who wants to understand this properly, that the historical evidences are always going to be the thing that give you the final conclusion. And that's not the case, because even epistemologically, that's not the case. So it's important to take the step back and understand, well, what is the philosophy of history? How do we make inferences from limited historical data? It's never 100% conclusion. It's never 100% true. So what I want to do is I want to bring them back to show them, well, irrespective of the way you viewed history, I have a source of knowledge here that I can show in my own way that it's a representation of the actual state of affairs. When it makes a claim about history, it's true because of X, Y, and Z. And it has a higher epistemic value, higher epistemic weight. I would still use the same approach because I think it's more empowering and it gets people to understand the mind of the Muslim, or the mind of why someone's accepting this to be true.
It's a deeper, to me, it feels like a deeper avenue, because there's one thing, like you kind of say, of looking at sort of evidence, historical evidence, and coming to a conclusion based on what's being asserted. But then there's the next thing of like, well, what's the details behind that conclusion that you've just read?